now. It's just a beautiful morning. Again, we've just been blessed with our Sunday mornings the past month or so, and just thankful we're able to continue to do this outside, and just everyone that's listening or watching. We just appreciate you as well. Just sure miss you, and just can't wait till things do get back to normal. I have a complete faith that they will, and at one point we'll be able to fellowship again in person and to give hugs and shake hands, and just look forward to those days, and I'm sure everybody else is as well. But just appreciate everybody being with us this morning. Wow, I've got a tremendous crowd this morning that showed up, and I don't know if it's because of the topic of the lesson or the advertising I've been doing the past several weeks. But guys, I'm glad we're all here. I'll just start out by saying that what I'm going to say this morning, I think what I'm going to say this morning is going to make us all think. I don't know how to say that or put it a different way. When we look at these verses, when we look at what Paul's saying, I'm going to throw out some points that some of you ain't going to agree with at the beginning. And what I ask you all to do, whether you're here watching or whether you're watching online or whether you're here with us this morning, is let's hang on to the end. We'll tie everything together, I think. But this is going to be a neat lesson this morning, I think, and I hope we get a lot out of it. For the times that we're living in right now, I don't know that there's a more pertinent lesson, if you will. But does anybody need a book? Has everybody got a book this year? Maxine, boys, would y'all go get a couple books? They're right there in the...
Right here they are.
Okay, never mind. They're right there. But anyway, just tickled to see all the folks that we do have here this morning, and just thankful for the opportunity for Macy and Brian, as they do and have done every week, to post it online so the folks at home can watch it as well. And we just really, really thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Macy. But anyway, as I've been saying ever since for the past 6 weeks or so, our lesson this morning is how should I respond to politics? And we just chuckle, right? Because that's such a pertinent topic as we look at the times that we're living in right now. The point of our lesson, though, is reflect Christ in how you interact with politics and government. Reflect Christ in how you interact with politics and government. And I want to start out on a light note. It may be the only light note we have for a while. One of my favorite political stories is Jerry Clyers talks about Marcel. And Marcel was tired of having to pay taxes for his pulpwood truck, and he decided he was going to run for House of Representatives in Mississippi. And so he went around all Mississippi in his district, and he was giving speeches and just doing real good. Said Marcel was up, and he was giving a speech one night in a community center, and said he got done. Said he gave just a great speech, and he got done. He said, "Is there any questions?" Said a man in the back of the room stood up, and it happened to be the man Marcel was running against. And that man says, "Marcel," he says, "is it true that the other night down the road you gave a speech and told everybody I was ignorant?" Marcel says, "No, that ain't true." He says, "I don't know how they found it out." And that's my best political joke I know. So I'll leave it at that this morning. But as we look at these verses in Romans chapter 13, we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 13 verses 1 through 10. As we look at these verses, I think it's important. And Franklin and I, we had we left Arkansas about 4 o'clock yesterday evening, and so Franklin and I had about 11 hours to discuss some of this, which was a blessing to me. But Franklin made the point, and I think it's such a wonderful point, that you can't take the book of Romans and look at it without taking the whole book as a whole and seeing what Paul was saying as a whole. And we got to talking about the danger, if you will, of pulling verses and looking at just a few verses without realizing the context behind those verses. And we've talked about this before in Sunday school, and I think it's so very important here. So before we get into our verses this morning, I want to just give a little bit of a lead in to Romans chapter 13. So let's start in Romans chapter 12, and we're going to look at verses 9, the last 12 verses, if you will, of Romans chapter 12. So Romans chapter 12, verse 9 says, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed them. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And so that's the last part. Those are the last verses of verse 12. And then we're going to get into the verses for our lesson this morning. So verse 13, our first group of verses is verse 13, Romans 13, chapters 1 through 4. And verse 1 says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doth evil." And so we see here in verse 1, we come off of chapter 12, where Paul's last line in chapter 12 is chapter 12, verse 21, says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And then in verse 1, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." And we're going to stop right here, because really verse 1 is just an overview of verses 2, 3, and 4. Verse 1 contains what Paul breaks down then in the following 3 verses after that. And so in verse 1, Paul says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." And Paul is talking about our civil authority, the rulers of our land, the rulers of our nation, the kings that we were under. And I think it's important to realize right here in verse 1 that the audience that Paul is writing to in Rome were under the power and under the authority of the emperor, Roman Emperor Nero. And we're looking around AD 50, and this man Nero was not a nice man, especially towards Christians. This man Nero was pretty evil when it comes to how he dealt with Christians. Yet Paul was commanding them, if you will, or telling them, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, to the governing authority. For there is no power but of God. And Paul was stating that God had put Nero in power, that as a leader, as an authority, God had placed him there. And then Paul goes on to say, the powers that be are ordained of God. Then in verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. And I want to stop right there, and we're going to have a lot of discussion right here. What is ultimately Paul saying? Does anybody want to throw it out?
God's in charge.
God's in charge, certainly. And by God being in charge, who has he placed to rule over man? Our governing body, right? I mean, that's what ultimately Paul is saying. Now, if you look at verse 1, where it says, the very beginning, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, Paul is commanding us, or telling us, or telling the Romans, that we are to be subject. We are to submit unto the higher powers, the powers of the governing bodies. Now, I don't know about y'all, but you sit here and you read this verse, and we think, wait a minute. How many of you have pause when you read that? Honestly, raise your hand. Jeff raised his hand. I raised my hand. I have pause when I read that verse. Because if you go back to what we as Americans believe, if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, if you will, if we read the Declaration of Independence, it says, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to be the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. I'm going to stop right there. What is our Declaration of Independence, and how does that tie to what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 13? That's pretty interesting, ain't it, folks? And the reason I bring this up, and this is why this lesson is going to be so much fun, is the fact that Paul is saying that we are to be subject. He's telling the Romans here to be subject to the higher power, but then we as Americans have as our declaration a declaration that said, in due course, it's time for men to separate and come out from the underneath. And y'all can read the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to spend my Sunday school lesson reading it, but we know what it says. It ultimately says that we declare our independence over a government that we felt was a tyranny upon us. And I don't know how else to say it, but then it seems to be in direct opposition of what Paul is saying here in Romans. Would y'all agree with that? Everybody's staring at me. I think you have to agree with it. But yeah, let's see what Paul is truly saying. And like Franklin says, we talked about last night, let's put all these things into context. if we go back to what Paul says in verse 12, and we're not going any further back in the book of Romans, but then to verse 12. If you look at the very last line in verse 12, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And then he goes into these verses 1 and 2 of 13, where he tells us to be subject unto the higher powers. Where he tells us in verse 2, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. What Paul is ultimately saying is that we are subject, that we submit to higher powers because it's the right thing to do. Because by submitting to authorities, to higher powers, to those in authority above us, by submitting, that we are acting out Christian love and showing that. Paul was also telling the Romans, and I'm going to say this, telling the Romans because that's who this letter was to. He's telling the Romans that as Christians, yes, we have the freedom. We have the freedom to disobey and just do what we will because God gave us that freedom through salvation. But yet that freedom does not mean that we should go about and not obey the laws of the land that we live in. And I feel like that's what Paul is trying to get at here in verses 1 and 2. If we look at verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. The authorities that we live under, government is not a terror to good works, but it's a terror to evil. If there wasn't civil government, what kind of laws would we have? What would the world be like that we live in? It would essentially be chaos, right? If we had no laws, all of us hate getting a speeding ticket, right? Me and the boys have had this conversation a million times about the limit on trout or ducks or whatever, and the game warden. But if there wasn't for a game warden, there wouldn't be nothing to hunt and fish, right? And those laws provide us the opportunity to do the neat things that we love to do. That speed limit of 55 saves a lot of wrecks, right? Although we like to gripe about it, and we don't think it's when we're the one that gets pulled over because we're going 62 and a 55 and we're trying to get to church on Sunday morning because I'm 5 minutes late already. We don't think that law is very fair. But yet, if there were no laws, if there was no government to enact those laws, think about what we would live in. And I think this is what Paul is trying to outline here. But in saying that, we're going to get pretty deep this morning because what Paul is saying is that we are to be subject to the higher powers. And the first thought that comes to my mind as I read verses 1 through 4 is, what would I have done if I lived in Germany in 1940? If I was a German citizen in 1940, what would I have done? Have y'all ever thought about that as it relates to these verses? What do y'all think? Any conversation on that? That's a crazy thought, right? It's a crazy thought. Paul's saying here that we are to be subject to the higher powers. When the higher powers is Adolf Hitler, what do we do then? Franklin and I were talking about it last night, so in detail. Hitler reined the churches in. One of the first things Hitler did was rein the churches in and got support of the churches. And there's no doubt in my mind that the churches in Germany preached Romans 13, chapters 1 through 4. And so the citizens in Germany, the Christians in Germany, what were they left to do? Think about that for a minute. We're going to come back to that. But then let's go to 13 small colonies in this new land of America in 1776. What England had done, what King George had done, yeah, we didn't like it. Yeah, we wanted to have representation for our taxation. Yeah, we didn't want to be subscripted and go into wars that had nothing to do with us. But in all due respect, King George in England was the higher authority. So by these verses, by what Paul is saying, did we have a right to declare our independence? Got to be some discussion on that, guys. Come on, I'm throwing out some crazy ideas right here. What do y'all think? Franklin and I had 10 hours to discuss this. What do y'all think?
I believe when our
I got Lonnie stumped.
no, I believe when our rights are threatened and when that ruler is doing something that is contrary to God's word, we have the right to change that government. I believe that.
Lonnie said when the ruler is doing something that's contrary to God's will, that we have the right to change that government. I think, Lonnie, you're on to the next points. You look at, and just what comes to my mind is Daniel, right? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? When you talk about these verses, and then you look and put them in context, and you have to go back to this Daniel and to his three friends. We know those stories, right? Nebuchadnezzar, who was an authority that we know that God put in place. God put Nebuchadnezzar in place. God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come and conquer Israel and to take them captives. And we find that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, that they were these young guys that were wrapped up in this captivity. And that as captives, we know the very beginning of that story. As captives, these four young men were obviously special. They were taken into the palace and they were to be educated and to be indoctrinated into the Babylonian belief and Babylonian society. And part of that indoctrination and part of that education was eating the fine foods that the Babylonians eat. But we know that these four young men could not eat those foods because they were against what God had told them to eat, and so they refused to eat those foods. And this is the very beginning of the story. And their handlers, the men that were sent, the Babylonians that were put in place of the school or to look after these young men, said, wait a minute, you've got to eat this. You've got to eat what everybody else eats. And Daniel and his amigos said, wait a minute, no, we're not going to eat it. Just give us this diet that God has told us and see if we don't flourish. And so their handlers gave them this diet, and sure enough, they flourished. So they obeyed God, and they have flourished in this ungodly society. Well, then we know the rest of the story, right? That Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when Nebuchadnezzar said he passed a law that you had to bow down and worship him, and they wouldn't do it. So they did not submit to the higher powers because the higher powers asked him to do something that was against God. And so they didn't submit. And we know the rest of that story, right? They were thrown into a fiery furnace. And weren't consumed. And God and Christ, if you will, was in amongst the furnace with them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, guys, come out. Come out. And it was an eye-opening experience for Nebuchadnezzar. And he opened his eyes to that. And the same story with Daniel, when me and Franklin was trying to remember the guy's name last night, and I forgot. But who was the king after Nebuchadnezzar? Lonnie, who was it? Sir, who's that? Darius, that's right. King Darius. Darius followed Nebuchadnezzar, and Darius proclaimed that everybody had to pray only to him, or they couldn't. No one could pray to God. And Daniel disobeyed and prayed to God, and he was therefore thrown into the lion's den. And we know that Daniel come out of the lion's den, and Darius, said, and Darius's eyes were opened to God because of Daniel's disobedience to this higher power, higher authority being of man. Guys, there's example after example of when it's not disobeying God's order in order to obey the order of man and the laws of man. And so I think that's exactly right to Lonnie's point. But having said, let me throw out one more example. We see this even more evident when Pilate was questioning Jesus before his crucifixion. And Pilate says, do you not know that I have the authority to crucify you or to let you go? And what was Jesus' response? Jesus told him, the only authority you have is what was given to you from above. Think about that. Jesus told Pilate, the only authority you have is what was given to you from above. So therefore, Jesus is proclaiming who made Pilate, who gave Pilate his authority. God did. But Jesus lets him know that the only authority, the only reason that Pilate had the authority to either let Jesus go or to crucify him was because God had given that to him. Now, guys, I'm throwing out a lot of things right there. Let's go back to this idea, and I'm just trying to make us think. So don't get mad at me yet. Don't turn yourselves off yet. I want us to think. Going back to being in Nazi Germany in 1940, and we have the wonderful example of Dietrich, Franklin, say his name? Bonhoeffer. There you go, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And y'all know the story of this man? If y'all, I know Franklin has read everything he's wrote, I think. He was a Christian, and he was one that infiltrated the Nazi regime as a Christian and tried to do what he could as a spy and to help bring down Hitler. And he was actually one that was part of the conspiracy to kill Hitler in 1944 and got caught and was executed for his part in that. But yet as a Christian, he stood up against a government and a man that was obviously going against God. But having said that, and you look at what these verses say, it's just, yes, we are to submit to the higher powers of our authority, but it's truly, example after example, that when those higher authorities go against what God says, then we obey God, just as Lonnie said. But I'm going to throw out the caveat. Our Declaration of Independence. Was England forcing the Americans to go and do something that God told us not to do? Lonnie, come on now. Lonnie shakes his head, no. It's truly, when you look at it, there's a tremendous difference between being a Christian in 1940 Germany and being a Christian in 1775 America. When you look at the authority that was over you. I don't know of any examples. I don't know of any examples of England asking the colonists in America to do something that was against God or disobeying God. I don't. There may be. I'm not saying I don't. I'm not an American history buff, but there may be. But I'm not aware of that. But yet, because of, if we go to the words of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's what we made our statement, and that's what our founding fathers did in putting this declaration together. Now, guys, don't stone me. I'm not saying that our nation was created. I thoroughly believe that our nation came to be as an authority of God, and that God had his hand in our nation's formation. I believe that. So then, let's go back, and how does that tie into verses 1 through 4? And the way that ties, and it goes back to Franklin's point, that you have to look at the context of who Paul was addressing this letter to, what he was saying. And what Paul was saying is that there is a purpose in government. And that purpose in government is to maintain civil obedience. And that as Christians, we should be a good Christian as well as a good citizen, as long as being a good citizen does not put us in odds with what God says. Is that a fair statement? Would everybody agree with that? You want me to say it again? We are to be a good Christian and a good citizen as long as being a good citizen does not put us at odds with what God tells us to do. Is that an accurate statement? Is that a fair assumption of what Paul is saying here in verses 1 through 4? I get a few head nods, so I'm thinking I'm on the right track. Franklin, you got any comment? Oh, come on. So that's what I ultimately feel like Paul is saying in verses 1 through 4. It goes back to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago in 1 Peter. In Peter writing his letter and telling the folks the importance of submitting. You know, it goes the same as in our marriage relationship, that we submit to our spouse. And that in doing so, and it was in exact context as if your spouse was not a Christian. The importance of submitting to that spouse is that you're living a Christ-like life through submission, and therefore in hopes of winning that spouse to Christ. As Christians in a civil government, when we submit to that authority, when it does not ask us to do something that's against God, we are good citizens, if you will. We in turn win folks to Christ by living a model citizenship. Now, before I go any further on this thought process, right now in our country, just like I'm sure in Germany, in other places around this world, verses 1 through 4 are used to tell people they shouldn't protest against the government because the government's the higher authority. And I don't believe that's right either. In our country today, it ain't right. In 1776, it wasn't right, in my opinion, to say that the Americas didn't have the right to protest against the British government. And I feel it with all my heart even today, that we have the right, when we see the government doing something wrong, just as our founding fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence, we have the right to protest against it and try to make a change and make it better. And so my point in saying that is in the things that we're going on and seeing around us today, and to try to use this verse to say that, well, we're supposed to be under the authority of our government and sole authority, and therefore we shouldn't protest or speak up when we see things that are wrong. I don't believe that that's what Paul is saying. And I hope everybody, I'm sure that some of you don't agree with me, but we're going to get to that here in a few more verses as well. So y'all just hang tight. Any discussion on verses 1 through 4? And I'm going to have to hurry. All right. Romans chapter 13, verses 5 through 7. And I'm going to be kind of brief because they're pretty well just going on this same track as the first 4 verses. Verse 5 says, "Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to them who tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And what Paul is saying in verses 5 through 7 is essentially that we give respect and we pay our taxes to who taxes are due, to who things are due. We give honor to who honor is due. We give fear to who fear is due. We give custom to who custom is due. It goes back to almost Jesus Christ saying, pay to God what's God and pay to Caesar what's Caesar's. That we, as citizens of an authority and of a government, that we pay what we are owed to do. Now, I think Paul was writing this, and again in context, they were Christians, they were Roman Christians Paul was writing this letter to, that said, look, this government is bad. Nero is bad. Roman has conquered Jerusalem. We wanted a Messiah. We wanted a king that was going to come and set Israel back. We wanted a king that was going to come and make Israel a great nation again. And we wanted this king. And we don't want to pay nothing to Rome. Rome has conquered us, and we don't want to do nothing for them. And we don't even want to be him. We don't want him to be our leader. And what Paul is saying is that as members of a government and of a country, that we pay and give honor where honors due, fear where fears due, custom where customs due, tribute to where tributes due. It goes back to Jesus Christ saying, give to God what's God and give to Caesar what's Caesar. And it just follows along that same line. And it's Paul's point that civil government has a purpose. And that purpose is to maintain an orderly society and for us to live and be a part of. Any discussion on that before we go to our last group of verses? I want to spend some time on it.
Okay, so just really quickly, the Bible is really clear about our duty to obey governments unless it does go against God's laws, unless we're commanded to do something that's totally wrong. The Bible's really clear that servants obey their masters, we obey the government, we obey the government's laws, and that God's going to take care of it and rule it the way He wants, but it's not our place to rebel. But I think that, there comes a point in time where when things are not, they go against what the Bible says, against the law of God, that there has to be a stand against it.
And I think you're exactly right, Lonnie. I think, like you said, there's examples throughout the Bible of that. If you even use, just using Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as the ultimate example in my mind of standing for what God says and in that being opposed to what the government of the time tells them to do. Anybody else before we go on? Sorry. All right. Our last group of verses this morning, I think, really ties this all together. And is that as we talk about the idea of politics in our government today, as we talk about the point of our lesson, reflect Christ in how you interact with politics and government. And let's look at that in relation to what Paul is going to say now in verses 8 through 10. Paul says, owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Guys, this is how Paul wraps up this verse, this group of verses, this idea of submitting to authority. He wraps it up in verse 8 saying, owe no man anything. Now, he's just talked about taxes, and we're to pay our taxes, right? And we're to pay our tribute to those that tributes due. And Paul says, owe no man anything. Meaning, we pay what's due to us. We pay the government, we pay all men. We're to owe no man anything. But then look what he says. But to love one another. Meaning our love debt can never be paid. Do you see what he's saying there? He's saying that I'm always to be in debt with Lonnie to pay him more love. I'm always to be in debt with Bonnie to pay her more love. I'm always to be in debt with my neighbor down the road and to pay them more love. I can never pay that debt off. Do you see what Paul's saying there? So it means that I always owe more love. Just as Jesus Christ never gives up and never pays off loving us, we are to never get paid up owing other people love. And so it's a debt we can never pay. Just as what Christ did for us on the cross, or he paid a debt we can never pay, we can never pay off the debt of love to all those around us. And Paul says, but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. He that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. So in all these dealings, when it talks about submitting to authority and the governing bodies that are around us, and this government that we're a part of, in all our dealings, whether it be, if we go back to chapter 12, and it talks about let love be genuine, Abhor to evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Then he goes to talk about blessed those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Paul is going in that. He leads into chapter 13. He leads into this idea about government. And then he's going to close with this same concept. That we owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Then he says, for this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. In order to fulfill these commandments, and Paul, in order to fulfill not committing adultery, not killing, not stealing, not bearing false witness, not coveting, and any other commandment that resembles that, in order to do that, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That sums up all those commandments. We know that when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus said, to love the Lord our God with our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and another is like it, to love our neighbor as what? As ourselves. Guys, let's look up, what does the word love mean? What is it? What is love? What is love? Say what? Charity. Exactly, Bonnie. Let's look at this. I kind of was a trick question. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. I'm going to skip to verse 13. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Think about what Paul is telling us to do right here. Think about what Jesus told us to do. The greatest commandment is to love our Lord God with our heart, soul, strength, and mind. The second is to love our neighbor as ourselves. What does it mean to love? It means that we're patient. It means that we're kind. It means that we don't envy. It means that we don't boast. It means that we're not proud. It means that we don't dishonor others. It means that we're not self-seeking. It means that we're not easily angered. It means that we don't keep records of wrongs. It means that love does not delight in evil. We don't delight in evil. We rejoice in the truth. We always protect, always trust, always hope, and always perseveres. That's what love is, right? Now, when we talk about all this other stuff we talked about going up to this and leading up to this, and we're talking about this idea of politics and how as Christians we're to live in today's society and under the government that we live in, the politics we live in. As Christians, we are called, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Can we truly say as a nation that in our political dealings right now that Christians are showing love to their neighbor as themselves? If y'all say yes, you're a lie. This is what Paul is wrapping this up. This is when it go to what Franklin's point of Paul and taking into context everything Paul is saying in verse 13. If we take into context what Paul is saying in reference to subjection to our government or higher authorities, but Paul resolves it all. He starts in verse 12 by saying, the end of verse 12, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's how he ends verse 12. And then he ends verse 13 by telling us to love our neighbor as ourselves. He puts in the middle this idea of subjection ourselves to governments and to the authorities that are above us. But he's telling us we do it all because of what? Because of love. We do it all in love. Let's look at verse. I'm just going to follow up in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Listen what this verse says. Y'all know it. I'm just reading it so you can get the context. Verse 13, verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men of the angels, but not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledges, and I have a faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all my possessions to the poor and give over my body to hardships that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall now know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three things remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest is love. You see what Paul's saying in verse 13? If you look and define what love is, that's what love is. If we, as the citizens of the United States, if the citizens of whatever country you live in, if we truly love one another, if we truly love our neighbor as ourselves, we'll change the world. Paul said, what did he say? Look, going back to the first part of verse 13, if I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. Think about what Paul's saying right there. But yet, in the world around us, whether it be in government, politics, whatever, we think, oh wow, these people, they're smart. We begin to think that ourselves. We think, well, I'm full of charity. I've given this. I've done this. I've done this. But is it truly out of love? Is what we're doing truly out of love? In my interactions with everybody that I come in contact with, if I truly do that out of love, it'll change the world. And as Christians, if we do that, that will change the world. Loving our neighbor as myself. Verse 10, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Paul goes in and just as a conclusion this morning, Paul is talking about this idea of subjecting ourselves to our government. He talks about this idea of, why we should do that, the government and obeying civil obedience and this and that. But then he concludes in verse 10, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. If we do everything, just as chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians says, when we do it out of love, we are ultimately fulfilling the law. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, going back to this line that so sticks in our mind, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know what? Our founding fathers had this in mind when they wrote that line. Do y'all agree with that? Loving your neighbors as ourselves. Has our nation always upheld this? Is our nation perfect at it? No, we're not. There's no way you can justify or even say for a second that we, from the beginning of this writing to even today, that us as a nation believe that all men were created equal. You can't make that statement that our nation has upheld that belief. But yet that belief was based on this fact of loving one another and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And as my prayer for our nation, my prayer for each of us today, as we conclude this morning in our lesson, is that through our political views, through our citizen views, that we strive to be good Christians and good citizens. And by being good Christians, that we do love one another. And that we fulfill what Paul said in verse 13 is what love is. That's my prayer for each of us, and that our nation will truly be a nation where it believes that all men are created equal. And it will make laws and move towards that. And that's our prayer, as far as I'm concerned, is what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 13. Guys, is there any discussion before we close this morning? If not, thank y'all very much.